During the long winters of medieval Europe, the interior life of a noble household changed in ways that shaped every moment of daily existence. If you find yourself drawn to examinations of how people lived, worked, and endured in past centuries, you may feel at home here, as this setting reveals a world where social order, economic dependence, and environmental hardship intersected with remarkable consistency. Winter imposed a structural rhythm in medieval society, particularly within the estates of the nobility, whose vast manorial complexes required constant labor to maintain function through the cold months. Heavy snow, reduced daylight, and limited mobility transformed these estates into semi-enclosed environments where servants, retainers, and household staff carried out tightly defined duties amidst resource scarcity and heightened domestic demands. Historical records from household accounts, manorial rolls, and ecclesiastical writings describe noble residences as micro-societies with formalized hierarchies and roles. Their winter routines reveal the connection between climate, social class, and labor distribution, offering insight into how medieval people interpreted responsibility and survival under extreme seasonal pressure. Archaeological findings, from preserved timber halls to storage cellars and heating installations, provide material evidence of how these households managed supplies and warmth. Meanwhile, contemporary chroniclers noted the contrast between the comfort of the Lord's solar and the unheated service quarters where most servants worked and slept. Winter intensified these contrasts, reshaping both the physical environment and the social dynamics inside the estate. The routines adopted during these months illuminate not only the structure of medieval households, but also the strategies by which servants navigated conditions that were simultaneously routine and severe. The scene ahead considers how these households were organized and how the internal structure of a noble residence shaped the winter experiences of those who served within it.
The structure of a medieval noble household formed a tightly organized system in which architecture, labor, and winter conditions were deeply interconnected. Large estates were typically centered around a great hall, ancillary chambers, service rooms, and outbuildings that supported agricultural and domestic production throughout the year. During winter, the spatial arrangement of these areas took on heightened significance as movement became restricted and essential tasks concentrated within the core of the residence. Historical manorial surveys and building accounts reveal how these estates were constructed to endure the challenges of cold seasons. Thick timber frames, wattle and daub walls, and thatched or wooden roofs provided insulation, while storerooms, pantries, and granaries were strategically positioned to protect supplies from moisture and frost. The Great Hall operated as the central communal space, its large hearth supplying warmth not only for dining and administrative gatherings, but also for the many dependents who relied upon its heat. Archaeological remains, particularly in England, France, and the Germanic regions, demonstrate the presence of cellars beneath noble residences used for storing salted meats, grains, ale, and preserved vegetables. These provisions were crucial during winter months when agricultural activity slowed and access to external markets became limited. The architectural design of these areas indicates a clear understanding of environmental constraints and the need for systematic preparation long before winter arrived. Winter also altered patterns of occupation within the household. Servants responsible for maintenance, cleaning, and food preparation concentrated their work near the warmest areas, often in cramped quarters adjacent to the hall or kitchens. Living spaces for lower-ranking staff were typically unheated, making the proximity to work zones a matter of both practicality and survival. Written accounts suggest that floors were covered with rushes or straw, replaced more frequently in winter to manage moisture brought in from the snow and mud outside. The organization of rooms reflected the hierarchy of the estate. Upper chambers and private solars, which benefited from more controlled heating, were reserved for the noble family. Below them, the service areas formed a dense network of activity, each space contributing to the estate's capacity to function through the harsh winter. This architectural stratification mirrored the social stratification, making the household itself a physical representation of medieval status and labor. The next section turns from the structure of the household to the hierarchy that shaped interactions within it, revealing how authority and obligation were negotiated during the most challenging season of the medieval year.
The hierarchy within a medieval noble household formed a highly stratified system in which authority, responsibility, and access to resources were distributed with precision. Winter intensified these dynamics, making social boundaries more visible as the demands of the season required strict coordination and uninterrupted service. Household ordinances from the 13th to 15th centuries outlined the roles of each servant in detail, from high-ranking stewards to the lowest scullery workers, illustrating how labor was structured to maintain stability during the harshest months. At the upper levels stood the steward, the bailiff, and in some regions the seneschal, individuals responsible for managing estate finances, agricultural stores, and legal matters. Their work became especially important in winter, when food preservation, fuel allocation, and resource planning were most critical. Below them, the chamberlain, butler, and marshal oversaw different household departments, personal quarters, wine and ale stores, and stabling, ensuring that operations continued regardless of weather conditions. Mid-ranking servants included kitchen staff, dairy workers, bakers, brewers, and those responsible for textile maintenance. Their labor was indispensable during winter, when noble households relied heavily on preserved foods, constant heat from the kitchen hearth, and the repair of wool garments and bedding. Archaeological evidence of soot accumulation, ceramic wear patterns, and textile fragments from castle sites supports the intensive year-round activity of these domestic environments. At the lowest level were general laborers, scullery workers, and young attendants who performed physically demanding and often poorly heated tasks. Winter made their duties particularly strenuous, carrying firewood through snow, drawing water from frozen wells, maintaining stable warmth for livestock, and cleaning heavily trafficked interiors muddied by wet boots and cloaks. Written accounts frequently note their limited rations and minimal sleeping arrangements, often in crowded, unheated rooms adjacent to kitchens or storage areas. Social mobility within this hierarchy was limited, but winter occasionally reshaped work patterns by increasing reliance on experienced staff. Individuals with knowledge of fuel management, livestock care, or food preservation gained temporary importance, though this shift rarely altered their formal status. The lord and lady of the household remained at the apex, directing labor through intermediaries and benefiting from the most comfortable spaces, private solars with shutters, tapestries, and controlled heat, while servants experienced far harsher conditions. This hierarchical order created the framework within which all winter labor took place. The next section examined the duties performed by servants during the coldest months, revealing how each role contributed to sustaining the estate through environmental hardship. The duties of servants within a medieval noble household expanded and intensified during winter, reflecting the increased demands placed on the estate by cold weather, limited daylight, and reduced access to external labor. Historical household accounts reveal that winter reshaped the rhythm of work, concentrating activity around heating, food preservation, livestock management, and the maintenance of indoor spaces that grew more crowded and harder to keep clean. Kitchen staff faced some of the heaviest responsibilities. With fresh produce scarce and travel restricted, meals relied heavily on salted meats, dried legumes, stored grains, and preserved herbs. Cooks and their assistants operated near continuously, managing large hearths that provided both heat and sustenance. Fuel had to be kept dry, ovens required constant tending, and brewing cycles for ale continued even during freezing temperatures. The kitchen became a central hub of activity, its warmth essential not only for cooking, but for the comfort of many servants who briefly sought relief from the cold. Laundry workers and textile maintainers saw their tasks complicated by winter conditions.
Garments became heavier with accumulated moisture, and drying took longer in unheated rooms. Woolen cloaks, bedding, and hangings required frequent care, with repairs more common due to the abrasive effects of frost, smoke, and daily use. Archaeological fragments of wool and linen found in castle contexts bear traces of mending techniques consistent with winter wear. Outside the kitchen and textile rooms, other duties continued despite the season. Servants responsible for firewood had to gather, split, and transport logs through snow and mud, ensuring a steady supply for the hall, kitchen, and private chambers. Stable workers attended to horses and livestock whose needs increased in winter as fodder had to be rationed carefully and living quarters kept dry. Frozen water sources required daily breaking, and animals needed close monitoring to prevent illness. Indoor maintenance duties also expanded. Floors layered with rushes became damp quickly, requiring more frequent replacement. Soot accumulated on rafters and cooking equipment, demanding regular cleaning. Lesser-known but essential roles, such as those who maintained candles and oil lamps, became crucial, as shorter daylight hours made artificial light indispensable for nearly every household task. Winter work patterns therefore reveal not only the complexity of domestic labor, but also the interdependence of roles within a noble household. Each responsibility supported another, forming a network of activity that sustained the estate through months of harsh conditions. The following scene examines how winter transformed these duties into greater physical strain, highlighting the environmental hardships endured by servants whose work rarely ceased despite the cold.
Winter work in a medieval noble household intensified every aspect of domestic labor, exposing servants to environmental conditions that shaped the rhythm of their days and the limits of their endurance. Historical climate data, drawn from dendrochronology, monastic chronicles, and agricultural accounts, indicates that winters during much of the Middle Ages were significantly colder than those of modern Western Europe. These temperatures transformed routine tasks into strenuous efforts marked by limited mobility, frozen materials, and heightened demands from both the household and the estate. Fuel management became one of the most critical responsibilities. Servants tasked with gathering and cutting firewood worked in freezing conditions, often at dawn, transporting loads through deep snow or hardened soil. Maintaining the hearth's continuous burn required constant vigilance, as failure meant discomfort for dozens of residents and potential disruption of kitchen operations. Ash removal, chimney scraping, and the repositioning of iron grates were necessary daily tasks that grew more difficult in cold, smoke-filled environments. Water collection posed additional challenges. Wells froze at the surface, requiring repeated breaking of ice, while distant water sources became treacherous to reach. Buckets were heavy, slippery, and prone to freezing to the touch, forcing servants to work with cloth wrappings or endure raw, cracked hands. Manorial records from Northern Europe frequently note winter allowances, slightly increased rations, or ale, granted to workers performing the most strenuous cold-weather labor. Outdoor maintenance responsibilities also increased. Servants had to clear walkways around the manor, reinforce livestock shelters, and inspect thatched roofs weakened by frost, snow load, or winter storms. Tools were brittle in low temperatures, and daylight hours were short, compressing strenuous tasks into narrow work periods. Inside the household, winter conditions created a different set of difficulties. Kitchens, though warmer, became humid and smoky, requiring constant circulation of air through shutters that could not remain open for long. Candle makers and lamp maintainers worked with stiffened tallow and thickened oils, substances that solidified quickly in the cold, making their preparation laborious. The risk of illness increased, as servants working near the hearth faced sudden shifts between heat and cold while moving through draft-filled corridors. Livestock care became a daily priority. Stable hands rationed fodder carefully, monitored animals vulnerable to respiratory diseases, and repaired stalls weakened by moisture. Handling hay and straw in the cold was physically demanding, and manure removal, necessary even in winter, was performed under conditions that medieval accounts describe as hard upon the body. These labor patterns reveal a winter season defined not by dormancy, but by continuous, intensified exertion. The next section examines how these demands intersected with the broader hardships of winter, shaping not only the servants' physical burdens, but also their living conditions and overall well-being.
The hardships faced by servants during medieval winters were the result of environmental pressures, structural inequalities, and the physical demands of continuous labor. While noble households possessed greater resources than ordinary peasant dwellings, the benefits of these resources were rarely distributed evenly, leaving servants exposed to conditions that shaped both their daily experience and long-term health. Written accounts from monastic treatises and medical texts describe winter as a period of heightened vulnerability, particularly for those working closest to the cold, smoke, and dampness that characterized service quarters. Living conditions for lower-ranking servants were cramped and poorly heated. Dormitory-style rooms near kitchens, stables, or storerooms lacked insulation, and drafts seeped through unsealed timber frames. Bedding consisted of simple pallets filled with straw or rushes that retained moisture during prolonged cold, increasing the risk of respiratory illness. Archaeological evidence from Manor sites shows soot deposition and limited ventilation in service corridors, indicating environments that were persistently smoky, humid, and cold despite ongoing attempts at heating. Nutrition also became a source of hardship. Although noble households were wealthier than most medieval communities, servants typically received restricted rations based on rank. These rations relied heavily on coarse bread, pottage, salted meats, and ale, with fresh food nearly absent in winter months. The caloric demands of heavy labor exceeded the nutritional value of these meals, contributing to fatigue and weakened immunity. Household ordinances occasionally reference winter allowances, but these provisions varied and rarely compensated for the intense workloads imposed by the season. Health concerns intensified during winter. Servants frequently suffered from chilblains, frostbite, respiratory infections, and joint pain from prolonged exposure to cold environments. Tasks that necessitated movement between heated and unheated spaces, such as carrying food from the kitchen to the hall or tending fires in distant chambers, exposed workers to abrupt temperature changes that contemporary medical writers associated with fevers and lung ailments. Injuries from slipping on ice, handling brittle tools, or lifting heavy frozen materials were also common. Social conditions compounded these physical difficulties. Hierarchical expectations constrained servants' ability to rest, seek warmth, or reduce workloads. The noble family retained priority over available heat sources, comfortable clothing, and protected spaces, reinforcing distinctions that became more pronounced during winter months. Accounts from legal disputes and household disciplinary records emphasize that failure to complete tasks, regardless of weather, was seldom excused, reflecting the strict expectations placed on domestic labor. Isolation also deepened during winter. Travel restrictions meant fewer external visitors, limited trade interactions, and reduced communication with nearby settlements. Servants working within the estate often remained on the grounds for weeks at a time, performing repetitive tasks with little variation and minimal respite from environmental stress. This confinement shaped the psychological dimension of winter hardship, though medieval sources describe it primarily through the lens of labor continuity rather than personal experience. These difficulties form the context in which winter labor acquired meaning within the broader social system of a noble household. The next section considers how the contrast between the hardship of servants and the relative comfort of the noble family shaped perceptions of privilege and authority during the coldest months of the medieval year. The contrast between the lived experience of servants and the privileges of the noble family became most visible during winter, when environmental pressures exposed the structural inequalities embedded within medieval households. Temperature, food supply, clothing quality, and access to private space were all distributed according to rank, creating a seasonal intensification of social hierarchy that shaped expectations and behavior within the estate. Private chambers reserved for the noble family were insulated with wooden shutters, heavy textiles, and tapestries that reduced drafts and retained warmth. Archaeological findings from aristocratic residences show evidence of glazed window panels in higher status rooms, an uncommon luxury in the Middle Ages, allowing limited light and reduced exposure to cold winds. These comforts created interior spaces where winter felt markedly less severe, reinforcing the symbolic and practical separation between rulers and those who served them. Clothing further emphasized these distinctions. Nobles possessed cloaks lined with fur, wool garments of fine weave, and boots designed to resist moisture and cold. Written inventories from the estates of high-ranking families listed imported fabrics, dyed wool, and fur trimmings that were unavailable to most servants. By contrast, domestic staff wore coarse woolen garments that absorbed dampness, increasing discomfort during repeated transitions between warm and unheated areas. Dietary privilege followed similar patterns. The noble family and their immediate retainers consumed higher quality foods during winter: fresh game, refined bread, spiced dishes, and wines stored in protected cellars. Household accounts indicate that these foods were reserved for the upper ranks, while servants received rations emphasizing preserved or coarse items. The caloric disparity between classes was particularly significant in winter months when labor demands on servants increased as access to nourishing food declined. Access to controlled heat also reflected social hierarchy. Fireplaces in private solars burned continuously, providing stable warmth for the noble household. Servants maintained these fires but were rarely permitted to stay in these rooms except when performing duties. Warmth was therefore both a physical resource and a social demarcation, marking who belonged within the protected core of the household and who operated at its margins. Even within communal spaces such as the Great Hall, seating arrangements reinforced privilege. Seating near the hearth was reserved for nobles and favored retainers, while lower-ranking servants stood away from the heat or remained in service corridors throughout the meal. These patterns appear consistently in medieval illustrations and household ordinances, emphasizing the symbolic function of warmth as a marker of status. Winter thus magnified pre-existing forms of inequality, shaping not only the conditions under which servants lived and worked, but also the perception of noble authority as inseparable from access to comfort, stability, and protection. The next section turns to the strategies, routines, and communal practices through which servants sought to endure these conditions and maintain their place within the household structure.
Survival for servants in a medieval noble household during winter depended on a combination of routine adaptation, communal support, and practical knowledge accumulated through generations of domestic labor. While the hierarchy of the estate determined access to resources, the endurance of servants rested on techniques developed to mitigate shortages of warmth, food, and rest under demanding conditions. Household records and ethnographic parallels suggest that these strategies formed an informal layer of culture within the estate, shaping how individuals navigated the winter months. One method of coping involved careful management of limited heat. Servants learned to time their movements to coincide with moments of warmth generated by the kitchen hearth or the great hall's fire. Duties were often grouped so that physically taxing tasks alternated with those performed indoors, allowing workers to recover briefly from exposure to the cold. Clothing adjustments also reflected experiential knowledge, layering coarse wool, stuffing boots with straw, or wrapping hands with cloth salvaged from worn textiles. Communal practices played an important role. Lower-ranking servants frequently slept in close quarters, sharing residual warmth and offering practical assistance when one member fell ill or became temporarily unable to complete tasks. Written accounts occasionally refer to the exchange of small favors, sharing thicker bedding, repairing each other's garments, or helping with demanding chores as a means of creating resilience within a system that offered little formal protection. Dietary coping strategies emerged out of necessity. Workers supplemented rations with leftover broth, crusts, or vegetable scraps from the kitchen, relying on improvisation to increase caloric intake during periods of heavy exertion. Archaeological findings of small personal storage pits or concealed food remnants in servant areas indicate that saving food for later consumption was a common practice, especially during harsh winters. Time management also shaped survival. With daylight scarce, tasks were organized around narrow windows of visibility, leading servants to develop efficient routines that minimized unnecessary movement through cold or dangerous areas of the estate.
Navigating icy steppes, frozen wells, and dim corridors required a familiarity with the household layout that newcomers often lacked, underscoring the importance of experience within domestic labor hierarchies. Despite limited autonomy, servants created microspaces of relative comfort, seated positions near the kitchen's residual heat, moments of silence between tasks, or opportunities to warm hands at a passing fire. These minor adjustments, though small in scale, played a significant role in daily endurance and reflect the pragmatic strategies by which individuals maintained their well-being in an environment shaped by both climatic pressure and social constraint. The patterns observed within winter survival practices illuminate the broader structure of medieval domestic life, revealing how environmental hardship intensified social hierarchies while also fostering adaptive behaviors among those responsible for sustaining the noble household.